Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned to find out more. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. You are in tune to another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. I am Hamza.
And I am David.
And ever since we started our podcast, we always like to highlight synchronicities because there are a lot of synchronicities and a lot of connecting the dots that we do not see, but sometimes when we talk about them or others talk about them, we can see how these stars aligned. And before we get started with our new guest, before I introduce her, that she is actually here based off of synchronicity. So a good friend of mine, Margie Eden in Atlanta, I've known her for years. She's a really good friend. She sent out an email over the holidays about a family member who had a new book out on Amazon and wanted to promote the book called Alchemy of Nourishment. And I was like, she needs to be on our podcast. This is just what intrinsic motivation is all about. We love to talk about things that motivate people and learn about life and nutrition and so on and so forth. And with that, I would like to introduce Esther Cohen to the podcast. Welcome, Esther.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. So I'm interested. It's interesting because the last two or three episodes, and we're on, I think, episode 45 or 46 now, but we are getting a huge concentration of people in Colorado through no intention whatsoever, but it seems like that is where all the cool kids hang out, and you're in Colorado as well.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. And the cool people do hang out here. But by that, I think there's a lot of people here who kind of are on the cutting edge of really, I'm going to say, energy, medicine, healing, exploration, really being able to integrate that into their daily life experience.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Esther, because I remember a long time ago, my parents had split up, and we moved to Florida to be around my grandparents, which was fantastic, a whole other story. But what was interesting in Orlando at the time was a huge majority of folks there were from the tri-state. They were from New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and it was like, wow, it's a second home. And in Colorado, I've heard in places like Utah, they're like California expats, where you can live like California, but the wages or the cost of living is a lot cheaper. Are you originally from California?
No, I'm originally from Georgia, from Atlanta.
That makes sense. So how are you related to Margie?
She's my sister. She's my older sister.
Margie's a gem.
But I moved to Colorado when I was 17, so it's been a long time.
Okay.
Since I
all right.
lived in the South. And I was really drawn out here by the mountains and the wildness. I grew up in the city. You know, I'd never gone camping. I'd never certainly rock climbed or anything like that. And it's just really much more of who I am as a person to be, you know, in the wilderness. And a lot of what my work is around, I would say, is really helping people reconnect with their wild nature, that aspect of ourselves that's not been so enculturated and diminished, and give it voice and just allow that expression to reconnect to our roots.
Now, you've been out there since you were 17, correct? You've been out there since you were 17?
Yes, that's correct.
So let me ask you, before moving out there, like I mentioned, I'm originally from New Jersey. David's from California, and we had different upbringings, let's say, from the traditional Bible Belt. And you mentioned that you were attracted to the wildness. What was life like in Georgia juxtaposed to what was really drawing you out to Colorado?
Oh, I would say that in Georgia, I just kind of envisioned myself following in the footsteps of my older siblings and kind of doing a more traditional life of going to college, maybe joining a sorority, a fraternity, and I don't know, getting a job. I think back then I was thinking I would be a therapist, a psychotherapist, and just being able to, I don't know, live my life in what I saw as a more patterned, traditional way. And I was one that I felt like I needed to really understand who I was, that was more my motivating factor than what I was going to become and what my work was going to be in the world, that I needed to have a much stronger connection to who I was to be able to find out what kind of work I wanted to do in the world.
So at 17, I mean, it's still a very impressionable age, and I'm just wondering, I want to stay here for a second, of the, not the pressure, but especially at that age, your parents want what's best for you, and you're in an environment that's really structured. I'm just wondering if they were automatically like, yeah, go west, young lady, we love you for it, or was it like, are you thinking this through? Do you really want to go beyond what we traditionally have done for our family?
I think it was mixed. My father passed away when I was 14. So, and I'm, 10 years younger than my sister. So, I think it was a real mixture of realizing that I was having a difficult time as I graduated high school a year early. And, I was in a place of life really needing to find some kind of core in myself, some kind of identity that I could, claim as my own and feel good about. And so my mother, in her wisdom, she helped drive me out west. She said, I think you do need to go for who you are. Even though it constantly rubbed against her in, I'll say, ways that she found difficult, she could recognize my spirit and my need to kind of connect with who I am. So she did encourage that, support that.
Wow. So Esther, how did you decide that you were going to go to Colorado? I mean, did you visit someone at one point in time and say, "Wow, I really like it here," or was it? How did you decide that that's where you were going to go?
Well, honestly, I was a real daddy's girl, and when I was real little, he would tell me stories. He had an uncle who lived in Colorado, and so it had this kind of mystique to me, and I had this idea that you were going to drop like right in the middle of the mountains. And coming from Atlanta, I had no idea what it was really like and about. So I just decided that's where I'm going to go. I really had no clue where or why I was going, except that it was, 1,500 miles away from what I knew.
Yeah.
And I thought I had to go be in a completely new environment to have a new experience of myself.
So when you first got there, was it like, right, I made the right decision, or was there like, man, what was I thinking? Or anything like that?
No, I was pretty jazzed when I got here. And, I don't know if you know Boulder, but and especially in those days, it wasn't nearly as crowded as it is now, and it just backs up to these beautiful foothills. And so I really became, a different person. I started running and mountain climbing and camping outdoors, and I just loved it.
Yeah.
I kind of found my niche.
Wow.
Did you find like the surrounding areas that were attracting you away from Colorado? Or one thing that I, in my personal experience, I used to be a national salesperson, so I got to go to a lot of fun cities, but I kind of kissed the ground when I came back here. Did you have a similar experience of, well, Colorado is great. Well, let me see about the surrounding areas if it gets any better than this?
Yeah, I did. I definitely, once I started heading out west, and I started, I went all the way to California, right? So I went through Utah and Nevada and New Mexico. And actually, I spent some time in New Mexico when I did my internship. I lived on the Navajo reservation, and I loved it there. But I knew that California wasn't my place. And, even later, years later, when I met my husband, he was very interested in living in California and San Diego. And, I could say I loved the area, but it wasn't my home. It wasn't where I really resonated with the environment. So I came back to Colorado.
You said that you lived you went through and spent some time in New Mexico on a reservation. Whereabouts?
In Chinle, Arizona, actually. It was right on the border of New Mexico. And I was on the Navajo reservation, Navajo and Hopi.
Oh, okay. Well, I lived in Albuquerque for 20 years, so I was just curious.
Yes, I spent a lot of time in, in Taos and Santa Fe and all around. Yeah. At one point I was part of a spiritual community that was down in southern New Mexico, on the San Francisco River down there.
Okay.
All right. Now, this is a stereotype or generalization, but in the South, they are known as a sedentary lifestyle, meat and potatoes type of environment. And we're here to talk about alchemy, nutrition, and nourishment and all that. Was your transition while you were living on the Navajo reservation, or did you even grow up with the traditional sedentary meat and potatoes lifestyle?
Well, I grew up on, kind of just given the nature of who I am, I started cooking really, really young. And, I grew up with your typical fried chicken, mashed potatoes, lima beans or butter beans. I became a vegetarian by the time I was 15. Mm-hmm. And I had I'm a professional cook, and I've been cooking for family and friends, as long as I can remember. So I think that was one reason that I left, is that at that time, I definitely, it wasn't so easy to be a vegetarian, and it wasn't easy to kind of learn about, I want to say natural eating. I don't even want to call it alternative eating, because it's only alternative to what I'll call the standard American diet. It's more our original way of eating. Mm. And so I've always had that as a part of kind of my quest, I should say.
What was it like during the holidays when you came home for Thanksgiving?
Oh my God! You really want me to answer this?
Esther's our special. She's our special family member.
Right. Well, everybody, I got a lot of, how can I say, I got a lot of flack for the fact that I really wasn't going to like our sweet potatoes with melted marshmallows on top, or the canned cranberry sauce, or, you name it, or the green bean casserole with cream of mushroom soup and fried, onion rings on the top. But I have to say, everybody was always really happy to have me cook for everybody. And they still are.
Before we dive into your book, I do want to ask you, because you were able to marry the two, and if they were happy to make you cook, did you kind of sneak some of the healthy ingredients into what was traditionally known as unhealthy?
Yeah, I think that's part of the art of what I do is, there's a great way to make a green bean casserole that's actually far more delicious, and just make it with whole foods. You don't need to use any processed or canned foods, and it's great. And I think that's one of the beauties of really educating people to eat well, is that when they taste it, not only do they taste the difference, they can really feel a resonance. They can feel a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an experience, and my whole orientation, I would say, is into what I call body sensing, where it's about a re-education and allowing your body to teach you and inform you about, whether it's food or the environment. How do you really digest it, and how does it feel, and does it really nourish you or not? Or do you walk away feeling still just a little bit hungry or empty or irritated?
That is the argument after people eat fast food. It's like it's short-lived, and you're hungry again an hour or two later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, there's such a, how can I say, we have such an epidemic now, with obesity, with type 2 diabetes, with heart disease, and fundamentally it comes down to how we feed ourselves and how we nourish ourselves and how we don't. And we really kind of lost connection to what it feels like to eat well and feel really good. I don't think we really know how good we are capable of feeling. There's just a lot of I'm this age, so I expect to be, achy and not to think as clearly and not to have the kind of energy that I had when I was 30 or 40. But I don't experience that and really believe that's so true.
Yeah, I agree.
Good. Right on.
You bring up a good point with that, Esther, because since you live in Boulder and part of the spiritual community, I did want to bring up, just recently I listened to Esther Hicks or Abraham Hicks all the time, and I love their material. It's great. So in one segment, Esther or Abraham was talking about how you feel supersedes anything. And so if you're eating McDonald's, but you feel really good about, not saying you should have a daily diet of McDonald's, but if you're eating McDonald's and it feels really good, then the way your body absorbs it is different than I'm eating McDonald's and I feel guilty about it. What's your take on that?
Absolutely. I call my work the Psychology of Nourishment and the Psychology of Eating. And I'll tell you a very similar story. I had a client who came to me, and he had very bad gut pain. And he said, I really want help, but I need to let you know that I love McDonald's. I eat it every day, and you can't take my McDonald's away from me. And I was like, okay, great, and I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to do here? And so I said, well, how do you, what's your lunchtime like? And he said, well, I usually leave my office, and I get in my car, and I go through the drive-through, and I get my double cheeseburger and fries, and I eat it in my car, and then I go back to work, and it's great. And I said, well, okay, what I really want you to do is to take that food and go to a park. And I want you to sit down, and you can use your phone and time yourself. And I want you to sit there for 15 minutes and chew your food and look at the scenery around you and, eat your lunch and eat McDonald's. Don't change anything else. I just want you to take this time. So he came back to me about 2 weeks later, and he walks in, and he's smiling, and I'm like, okay, so what happened? And he says, well, I feel great. And I'm like, well, that's great. And I said, well, so what are you doing? And he said, well, have you ever sat down and really eaten a McDonald's hamburger slowly and tasted it? And I said, well, honestly, no. And he said, after 3 days of eating like that, I felt like I had to go find myself something else to eat. And he quit eating his McDonald's hamburgers at lunch, and he had to take the full 15 minutes to eat. And it was a complete change, I'm going to say energetically, emotionally, and physically of eating. And so he didn't have indigestion anymore. And, I think if he had really loved how it tasted, that he, perhaps could have eaten it at a slower pace, eaten it in this, beautiful, natural environment and felt good. But what happened was beyond my expectation, and he actually tasted the hamburger and decided he didn't like it anymore.
Wow. Now, yeah, that's a beautiful story. That's a great story.
So I feel like a part of what gets me, really excited in working with clients is my objective is to teach people, to educate them how to really feel an experience as opposed to think of an experience. Because so much of us immediately go to what I'm going to call our head brain as opposed to our belly brain, our enteric nervous system, and to our heart brain, our, feeling center. And so the more that we can actually have a somatic bodily experience, the more it kind of integrates fully into a cellular resonance. And I think that's what Esther Hicks Abraham was talking to, that we can change our cellular capacity, the health and well-being of our cells, by having a higher resonance. And that resonance of pleasure and joy really allows there to be fluidity and what I want to say, mobility and receptivity within the cell. Because otherwise, if you look at all our chronic diseases, what happens is our cells become very rigid and resistant. And so they can't receive or communicate back and forth, and they can't receive the hormonal information that's necessary for the cell to really thrive.
Mm-hmm.
That makes
One
sense.
thing that, yeah, it makes total sense. I do want to share, I think you'll appreciate this. So in my old corporate life, I worked with a architecture firm, and we designed research labs. So we did the CDC lab out in Boulder and the CDC lab here in Atlanta, what have you. And since I was a salesperson, I had to go around the country so we can design vet labs and all types of research labs. So anyway, what's pertinent for this story is I was riding around with a vet at Emory who was a client, and they had an experiment, I want to say the late 1990s, early 2000s, where they fed mice a steady diet of fast food for 30 days, and the mice wind up getting type 2 diabetes after, I think, like day 18. So it's just really interesting, a steady diet of that in mice. Right. And I think there was a movie, Super Size Me, where something similar happened to them.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there was a great study with mice where they actually took the flavor, gave them, I guess their typical mouse food, and then they gave them food that had no flavor to it whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And the mice died. They starved to death, even though they were eating the food, because it never registered in their body, in their brain, without the taste.
Wait. Wow.
Yeah, the taste sensation, and they starved to death.
Wow.
Now I have a question on the other side of that.
Yeah.
So on the Psychology of Nourishment, and you were just talking about the mice and the taste, one thing that triggered me as what stood out from that, there were a number of things from that story about that person who went out for 15 minutes. But I was kind of looking at it from two different areas. The first part is the fact that person actually sat out intentionally for 15 minutes, like you said, at a park. So all they did was actually relax from, they weren't thinking about their day, what was going on at work or anything like that. And that gave them that time. They may not have known it, but it gave them that time to actually ingest the food as opposed to taking it from the drive-in, eating it on the way back to the office, and getting back to work, where people are just feeding themselves. They're not really enjoying the food.
Right.
And then the second part, when you're talking about taste, I remember always being jealous, if you can imagine, but I was jealous of the people at work that went out for a smoke break. I didn't smoke, so why don't I get the 15 minutes? But the fact that they seemed more relaxed because they were actually outside smoking it, and they had that taste of that nicotine potentially. I'm just looking at it from the psychology of ingesting.
Well, exactly. Like what I like to say, I use eating as a metaphor, and we eat everything. We eat this conversation we have. We're eating the environment that we're sitting in. We're eating the outdoor experience. We're eating the music we listen to. We're ingesting all of those impressions. We're taking them all in, and how well we're able to break them down, assimilate them, allow them to circulate in our body and nourish us is our capacity to be really fully nourished by life. And unfortunately, we move so quickly from experience to experience that we often don't fully assimilate and digest our experience. So like what happened for him is he was able to actually be nourished by the park that he was sitting in that 15 minutes in a way that he'd never experienced.
Yeah.
So he could have an experience of the emptiness of the food versus the fullness of the beauty of the environment he was in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's really rather fun to observe, just to begin to become aware and to watch these kinds of things, because what happened when he was eating in the car is that he never really went out of sympathetic nervous system. It's as if he had his foot on the gas pedal for his nervous system and that cortisol level. So he was constantly in this fight or flight. And when he, stopped and sat down, it's like he took his foot off the gas pedal and the whole body could go, and have a new experience.
So help me out here. I'm a little confused. I thought the best time to eat was when you're watching the nightly news.
That's real. I grew up watching the end of the Vietnam War when I was a little girl, and it was always so tense. I hated dinner time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, one of the many assignments that I give my clients is like put on beautiful music, have a nice flower arrangement, a candle, but to not read a book or, not watch TV until later on. But even if you do watch TV, that it's more of a fun kind of experience. Maybe you're with your family and or you're with your partner, and it's something uplifting. Don't sit and watch the 6 o'clock news while you're trying. You just can't digest both simultaneously.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, usually at dinner time a generation ago, everyone sat at the dinner table and talked about their day, but now the children's schedules are just as packed, if not more so, than their parents. So what are some ways that you're getting clients to take a breath while they're eating to have more family time?
Well, because I get so many families, where kids have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorders or other behavioral issues, and I have to explain a lot about what are called excitotoxins. They're preservatives and colorings and different additives in our food create actual neuron excitability in the brain, which contributes to why these children can't focus and sit down. So I really encourage them to try to make, 15, 20 minutes of some kind of fun mealtime and to have some conversation or, to have some nice music playing, and, if you've got to go from 100 miles an hour and you're trying to get down to 25 miles an hour, you got to step it down. So maybe they'll watch a slower paced type of TV if they're used to watching something, but definitely not on computers or, iPhones or anything like that, because the frequency that those images are flickering at really affect the brain, and so it really affects your ability to be able to assimilate your food, and it keeps your body in this kind of hyper tonal or hyper vigilant state. So, I try to get mealtime to be absolutely the most important time where they can begin to shift some of these behaviors.
One thing that was interesting. Go ahead. I was just thinking about the movie Super Size Me, and
right.
In the movie they had mentioned that other cultures outside of America, when they go to the supermarket, they usually go on the surrounding areas. That's where the fresh food is. And most Americans usually shop inside where you have the preservatives and what have you.
Right.
And the other argument in the movie was, well, I can't afford all that fresh food. I can't go to Whole Foods. So what suggestions would you make for someone to have a healthy diet on a budget?
You still have to shop the outer rims of the supermarket. And we have what's called the Dirty Dozen or the Dirty 13. And those are the foods, the vegetables that you definitely do not want to buy non-organic. And, as it becomes more and more of a movement in this country, then we'll see the costs come down in organics. It's got to be where people stand up and make a difference, because the amount of pesticides and glyphosate, which is Roundup Ready, which is in our food, is killing literally our population. And so it's critical, especially for children, but adults as well, to get remove that from our diet. So I try to educate people how to make simple meals, with whole foods. And, there's plenty of beans and grains that you can buy much less inexpensively, and just getting fresh foods. And teaching people how to really use herbs and spices, because I think that's a bit lost in our culture. That's, much more prevalent in traditional cuisines, like our Mexican food or our Indian food. The reason that we love them so much is they're really rich in herbs and spices, and so they have a lot of flavor rather than flavor enhancers. They're naturally rich on their own.
Yeah.
But it is a problem. I mean, it's well, I don't want to say it's a social problem of economics that exists on so many different levels. But one of my big, now I'm going to get on my soapbox here, but I was very affected by the lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, and I really wanted to go out there and raise the money to make smoothies, detoxification smoothies for the children that basically had a lot of berries in them and foods that actually can detoxify heavy metal poisoning, and get some good fish oils in there and some probiotics, all the foods that these children, because they're on poverty level, they never have, and naturally chelate, which means that you can naturally bind to those toxins and remove them out of the body. And, it's just really difficult to get funding, and not to get funding, but I was just trying to get, the mayor and the doctor who was in charge of the study, just to get their attention, like, hey, let's do something to start to detoxify these kids, and so that they can be healthy, because this lead poisoning is extremely serious, and it's going to affect not only their physicality, but their mental behavioral development. And it's really hard to get this kind of cultural change that can make that happen.
Yeah. Did you get a lot of pushback?
I got no reception whatsoever. Like they just, they didn't want to hear about it. And it's very interesting. 2 years later, they still don't even get good water.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a wash. But what's really sad, and I think that is kind of unknown, is that so many of our public water systems do have high lead content. And, there's a lot of research out right now that's showing how higher levels of these heavy metals lead to more criminal behavior.
Yeah.
And so you can start to, see such a big link between poverty and, behavioral issues, and then criminal issues, and, that inability to really kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, but, because it's already been negated from early childhood development.
Yeah, we can go on a whole other tangent on a sinful hat talk about that.
I don't know how that got in there, but that's really my really.
You snuck that in there, Esther.
I did. I didn't know. I didn't know. But if we could get this into the elementary school systems across the country, we would just really change our population.
One thing that's really interesting, I'm glad we're having this conversation now, because it's January 17th, 2018, and if we look at the numbers, by February 1st, everyone that started with their intention for a New Year's resolution goes away. So, hopefully we'll get the message out with people hearing your talk. But when you talked about Michigan, it made me think of, like you said, the psychology and the misnomer of a smoothie. It seems like a luxury, like that's something that an upper class person would pay for, and that's unfortunately what is the association when you say that. That's probably why you didn't get any feedback. And one thing that I found is after Amazon bought Whole Foods last year, a lot of their prices have come down considerably. So, it's more of getting that message out there that there are alternatives, one of which is the Alchemy of Nourishment. So I'd like to have you talk about, how you started the Alchemy of Nourishment, what that foundation is, talk about your book, but how did it all come about?
Let's see. I guess you could say this has kind of been my passion ever since I was very young. In fact, that I've been cooking, and as I grew older, I gravitated and tried to learn as much as I could about cooking with whole foods. And at a very young age, when I was like 20, 21, I started a Whole Foods catering company. And so I learned to bake bread, make sourdoughs, make basically all our foods from scratch. And it was tremendously successful, which led me to go and get my master's in nutrition. I was an artist. That's my undergraduate degree. And I became kind of dogmatic about there must be a better way to be healthy than what I know and what I see in front of me. And so I basically just followed my passion, and that led me to meeting some really extraordinary people. And then I began to really understand that it was much more than just the kind of the science or the vitamins and minerals that make up our food, that there's a whole nother quality to our food that I would call the energetic qualities, when we talk about things resonating with one another, that there's that vibrational essence or quality of a food and how it grows and where it is and what kind of food it is, that also gives us a quality of energy. And that's equally as important as, the way we can measure vitamins, nutrients, or fats and carbohydrates and proteins. So, first I went the scientific route, and then I had to go, but why does, two people who eat the same food in the same quantity, why is one heavy and the other's not? Why is one depressed and the other's not? So, I'm kind of a nerd that way. I had to study the psychoneuroimmunology and understand the science so that I could make a bridge between the science and what I'll call the energetics, or that vibrational world that Esther Hicks, Abraham speaks through her about. And so my book is called The Art, Science, and Magic of Eating, and it really explains about the fact that we are eaters and we eat everything. We eat our conversations, and we eat our dinner. And so what is the quality of the nourishment that we're taking in? And the higher that quality, the more efficient and the more the fuller our nourishment, and that really equates to thriving and a certain vibrancy and health and our relationship to others and to everything that we're doing.
One thing I found, and I didn't know until I started doing some research on talking to you, but I saw that there's a market for even a vegan dog food. And do you, right? I was like, what, are you serious? But apparently there's a market for it. And I'm thinking in Colorado, it's probably a normal conversation that, yes, I'm vegan and so is my dog. Or is that the case out there?
Yeah, you definitely can find that out here. I mean, I have to say that my dogs eat grain-free diets, but that's because I'm looking at, well, what did a dog eat? I mean, dogs didn't go around eating corn.
Yeah.
You know, if you look at the, you know, kind of the evolution of the dog or the wolf, they ate meat. And that's how their system has evolved to digest. So for many of us, the foods that we eat, they didn't even exist 50 years ago. So we have no biological capacity to really digest those foods.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many chemicals that are in there that our bodies can't recognize, especially when you get to the foods that, like, are the no-fat, you know, like Alestra and, you know, aspartame, that our biology, our cellular makeup cannot recognize those chemical substances. Well, you know, how long has man been around? 400,000 years. And, you know, 20 years of that kind of chemical going to our body is like a half a second on a, you know, evolutionary clock. It's nothing.
Yeah. What is your feeling on, or your take on vaccines for children?
Oh, my goodness, you're really opening up a big door here.
Don't even get me started.
David likes poking the hornet's nest.
Introduce you to my mom.
Really
You guys had a good conversation on that one.
Oh, my gosh, that's a big one. I think that there's, great.
You can make it brief.
I'm going to make it brief. But
okay.
There's a lot of information, and I'll actually email you this particular movie that you should watch. A lot of things are going into vaccines since Ronald Reagan was president that have never been in vaccines, and they do not have to be scientifically tested by the different drug companies. And there's a lot of research out there of what's happening when we give these vaccines in third world countries, because we don't do the research here in our country. And I really advise my clients to not get the whole package. There's way too much invasion on the immune system at once, and there's a lot of fillers and transports in these vaccines that are very harmful to the body. So I like my clients to allow their children to be older and to get their immune systems to start to develop and have strength on their own, and then simplify the vaccines.
Yeah.
But that's a huge education that's got to happen. And there's, you know, honestly, there's a lot of money that keeps that from happening.
Yeah. We don't want to disrupt
that's a big can of worms.
Yeah. I was really surprised last year when our current president, our commander-in-chief, they asked him about vaccines and was he going to get a flu shot and what have you. He's like, that stuff never works. And I was just like, the lobbyists in the pharmaceutical industry will be knocking on his door first thing in the morning.
Oh, right.
Never really.
And then look who he nominated for the head of it.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So they did. They knocked on his door. And, you know, it was easy for them because he says so many things that he says the opposite the next day.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But I had a real problem, you know, even on NPR, it must have been like a couple of weeks ago, they were talking about, you know, we have a new strain of flu that's spreading through the country this year, and they start off the report talking about how they had it in Australia, and our typical flu vaccine isn't really, I would say, designated. It doesn't really help diminish this new, species of flu, but we should get the flu shot anyway. And then the next statement was, and one of the reasons you should get it is because if you go to church and you have a cold and, you're going to feel pretty bad about giving the flu to your, congregation members. And I was just like, oh my God, this is crazy.
Wow.
Here we have a flu shot that it's not even necessarily effective. And not only that, we're playing in everybody's, guilt and conscience, whether you decide to get the flu shot or not. So it's a big arena that, I'm glad it's starting to come up for conversation, but,
Well, since we got you riled up, I guess we'll keep it going a little bit. So.
No.
Let me add fuel to the fire here, Esther. So you had mentioned, the past 15 years or so, our bodies have been trying to adjust to all these different additives and preservatives that are in our food and in our water, what have you. What's your take on that as being a response to potential food shortage with this population growth? And this is how, if people knew how much actual natural food exists, there would be panic.
So let me make sure I understand this question right. Are you saying that we have a food shortage of natural foods?
There is one perception out there that all these additives exist so they can kind of spread the food out to the population so they can eat instead of not eating.
I think that's a complete lie that's being fed to the culture, and that it's run by, Monsanto, that genetically modifies the foods and creates all the glycophosphates that are pesticides and growth hormones that go on the food. And so there's lots of wild foods, and there's plenty that we can, grow in a much more organic, and by organic I mean, in more dynamic relationship with nature. That these different chemicals and genetically modified foods actually create insects that are resistant to these different chemicals, so that they mutate and become stronger. And it's the same way with penicillin and antibiotics, that now we're becoming resistant to them. So these bacteria have mutated and have evolved to be resistant to these antibiotics. So we have a huge, issue there as a culture. And so we've got to learn how to grow our food in a way that doesn't strip the natural minerals and the microbiome out of our soils, so that we can produce a healthy population of people.
I told you we'd get you riled up a little bit.
You did. You got me. You definitely, So that's a big topic, and I guess, I like to be able to, state, how can I say, research and be able to do that, which, not knowing what we were going to talk about, I don't have those things in front of me, but you get my bit more emotional input. And my concern, a lot of my book is about detoxification. It's just really how toxic our food system has become, and that our bodies can't handle that toxic burden. And, that's why we're seeing astronomical numbers of people with diabetes and cancer and all kinds of diseases. And these are all diseases that are internally created. where, at the turn of the 19th century was the first time we began to see disease that became internal as opposed to externally originated.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
Oh, just for the record, I just want to have it on the recording because a lot of people still look at Monsanto, but I know that they were acquired by Bayer, or they have some type of partnership with Bayer now. So a lot of people aren't looking at Bayer, where they may be doing more research under the Bayer umbrella while people are still focusing on Monsanto. But you did mention in the 1900s you started looking internally, or the trend was to start looking internally. Could you let us know how I see on your site that you're listed as an intuitive nutrition counselor. So what part of what is the process when somebody comes to see an intuitive nutrition counselor?
Oh, okay. So when I can read energy, like I'm a medical intuitive, so I can see where there is stagnation or where there is where a system is not functioning correctly. And then I'm also looking at, why, my question and exploration is, why is this breast cancer in this woman and maybe, ovarian cancer in another woman, or type 2 diabetes? I'm looking at not only, okay, you've got this disease and how are we going to remediate it, or how are we going to heal it, but I'm trying to understand more of what the expression is about. In other words, I look at all our organs and all our physiology holds a consciousness. And by that I mean our liver, not only does it work physiologically, but how it works physiologically informs us about how it works energetically. Like the liver, we call it the liver because it has the capacity to rejuvenate itself. You can lose 2/3 of your liver and it can regrow itself, right? So it's really about that quality of regeneration, and it holds a consciousness, as you can understand through Chinese medicine, of being a visionary, and the liver is very connected to the eyes as well. And it has the capacity of being the general, and that when the health of the liver is optimal, the rest of the body, it cleanses the blood that goes to the heart. So when we digest food, it goes immediately to the liver that detoxifies it and then sends us pure nutrients to the heart. So it performs over 500 functions, and it's like the workhorse of the body. So if somebody has a liver issue, we'll say, I'm looking at, how are they overdoing? How are they overliving? How are they underliving? Where does their sense of vision and the ability to see the big picture, how is that affected, in their life? Where do they feel like they've lost their spirit? So we're looking more energetically to explore some of the beliefs, habits, and patterns that each person holds that's affecting their physiology over time. That makes sense?
No, that was a great explanation. And we are actually at the top of the hour. This hour has flown by, especially since we got you riled up. I want to see if we can get you riled up for another 60 minutes.
You can see I'm kind of passionate about all this. So.
Oh, yeah, no, not at all. Not at all. Please, if you remember, send us an email with the documentary about the vaccines. I'd love to see it. And for those on the podcast, if you hit us up, those on the podcast, if you listen and you go to intrinsicmotivation.life, and you send us an email, I might share that documentary with you. So there's a little incentive on that. And before we head out, I would love for you to give us your where we can find you. And you have a brand new book out on Amazon. I'd love for you to plug that and where else they can find you on the World Wide Web.
At www.alchemyofnourishment.com.
Great. Okay, I have to ask one last question. Esther, what's your favorite green drink?
My favorite? Oh, it's the one that I make.
Okay, what is it?
What is it? So it usually has a handful of watercress and a handful of spinach and blueberries and a little bit of black cherry juice, not from concentrate, and a little bit of fish oil. I like to think of it as a delivery system, some homemade yogurt, and maybe a half apple.
Wow, sounds great.
And that's it. And then I mix it all up different ways, but that's my favorite.
All right, well, mine's a lemon ginger blast. You probably have heard of those.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, my absolute most favorite drink, and you'll have to look in your book, is turmeric sunrise.
Oh, yeah. I usually add turmeric to my lemon ginger blast, and maybe once in a while habanero chili, so.
Woohoo, that is a blast.
Yeah, that's a hot one, but it's
a hot one.
Yeah, but it's good though. So, okay,
that
I was
keeps
just
things
kidding.
moving, though.
Yeah. Cleans you out.
I'm going to follow your suggestion, Esther, and do that watercress and spinach as I watch X-Files next. So that will be my little treat for tonight.
That sounds great. So my two bits for watercress is it's the most anti-cancer plant on the planet.
Watercress, all right.
Mm.
Yeah. And it's nice, and it gives you that spiciness.
Absolutely. Wow, that was a great way to end it. And it was definitely a pleasure, Esther Cohen. You have been in tune to another podcast episode of Intrinsic Motivation of a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
And Esther, definitely we thank you for taking the time to meet with us, and let's stay in touch so we can have you on for a future episode.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been really fun.
Yeah.
Awesome. Talk to you soon. Cheers, guys.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Woohoo, boy, that was great. Yeah.
Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast. Please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for future podcasts that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. Check you out next time. Have a great day.